morning. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Adam Phillips. I'm pastor here at Christ Church and First Christian Church with my esteemed colleague, the Reverend Amy Pius. We started Bridgetown Forum this year to facilitate common good conversations, to facilitate not just dialogue and words, but to inspire action. And we had a really wonderful gathering in January with Jim Wallace from Sojourners on anti-racism. We had a really timely evening with Matthew Bynes around his book, God and the Gay Christian. And tonight we are having another timely conversation around homelessness. Every night in Portland there are 800 homeless families with children, which are made up of almost 1,500 individuals. It's a crisis that we, I think, know quite well. Anyone with eyes to see can see that we have a real crisis on our hands. I moved here to Portland 3 years ago and quickly realized that there was a homeless situation in Portland. I moved from Washington, D.C., where you think back on the East Coast, of course, you have all these tough inner city neighborhoods and so forth, but I was really surprised at how drastic it seemed to me in Portland, a city where people are coming to move and live affordably in some ways, but that affordability is going away, it seems, right? I just bought a house with my wife a month ago, and we're literally just relieved that we found one that we could afford. It's a really acute situation affecting people across the economic spectrum. I come at this from a faith perspective. I come out of this motivated by my tradition, which is embodied by a lot of different cast of characters, but one of my favorite saints that's still living is Desmond Tutu, who says that we are prisoners of hope. So we don't just look at the world and we see the world like falling apart, but we look at the world as a place where hope can take root and take shape and things can change, that we can actually mold it, that we can do our part to fix things and mold a future that we all hope to see. So that's tonight's evening. I'm excited that we have each of these amazing leaders in Portland, each doing their own unique part, whether it's direct service, whether it's advocacy, whether it's even administrative and government work. I want to bring up Brandi Tuck, who's a dear friend of mine, and the first kind of wise elder in Portland for me on the homeless and housing opportunities that we have. So Brandi's going to kind of help us get going tonight. Thanks, Brandi.
Hi, everyone. I am Brandi Tuck, Executive Director at Portland Homeless Family Solutions. Our mission is to empower homeless families with children to get back into housing and to stay there long term. Just a little tiny bit about us, and then I've got a lot to talk about homelessness. We are an organization that empowers homeless families with children to move back into housing. We have a couple shelters downtown Portland for families. We offer rapid rehousing, case management, and teach life skills classes to help families learn the skills and tools they need to keep their housing long term. I am very honored to be here tonight to give you my perspective about the current state of homelessness, to talk about the root causes of homelessness, and to share how I think our community can end homelessness. So first, a little bit about the history of homelessness in America. In the 1930s, as you all know, our country experienced the Great Depression. For the first time in American history, regular individuals and families with children suffered extreme poverty and homelessness. People were living in substandard conditions, building shanty towns just so they had a roof over their head, and it was one of the worst times in American history. So President Roosevelt enacted the New Deal. He developed legislation that set up protections for people living in poverty, things like the GI Bill, which sent people to get better educations and be able to obtain property so that they could escape lifelong poverty, and building affordable housing. The federal government at that time was dedicating about $89 billion a year toward the creation and maintenance of affordable housing. And so this allowed the federal government to build up a supply of public housing that was affordable for the American family. Because of the successes of the New Deal, homelessness and extreme poverty basically went away from the 1940s all the way to the 1980s. There was always some level of homelessness. Think your kind of typical people that ride the trains and live a life off the grid, or people who would have a short experience with homelessness. But we didn't really have homelessness as we know it today. The federal government continued to invest $89 billion a year to create, maintain, and operate affordable housing in our country for decades, until in 1980, Reagan was elected president. And he made two big policy decisions that have really shaped the American policy scene for the last 3 decades. First, Reagan cut the Federal Housing Authority budget from $89 billion a year down to $20 billion a year. And many publicly funded affordable housing units fell into disrepair and were closed down, and new construction halted. Second, Reagan shut down the mental health hospitals, the inpatient hospitals, and hundreds of thousands of people experiencing mental health challenges were released back onto the streets, many without any place to go. And so because of these two policy decisions, the country experienced an epidemic of homelessness for the first time since the 1930s. We had individual families and children losing their housing and living on the streets. And the government solution in the 80s and 90s was to build up shelter to house these families. Whereas the federal government had invested $89 billion a year in the past, in the 80s and 90s, they really started funding emergency shelter to house all the people who were now living on the streets. Billions of dollars were spent to build up shelters, funding social service nonprofit agencies, and offering other emergency responses for families and people who experience homelessness. Since the 1980s, there has not been any meaningful investment in housing in our country. And these days, we simply don't have enough units for everyone who needs them. In Multnomah County alone, we're short 28,000 units of affordable housing. When you look at the Tri-County area, it's over 44,000 units. The government continues to invest billions of dollars in emergency services for people experiencing homelessness, but they haven't invested in building or maintaining housing units. At the end of the day, homelessness is a housing issue, and that's where we are today in Portland. According to the 2015 one-night street and shelter count conducted by Multnomah County and the City of Portland, on any given night in Portland, over 16,000 people experience homelessness. That number includes over 3,000 homeless families with children. Over my time at PHSS, I have really seen a few primary root causes of homelessness, and I'd like to share those with you today. The first two really go hand in hand: a lack of affordable housing and a lack of a living wage. A living wage is defined as a wage sufficient to provide the necessities and comforts essential to an acceptable standard of living, and provides one with some ability to deal with emergencies without resorting to welfare or other public assistance. In the City of Portland, a living wage for one adult is $11.25 an hour. When you add one child into the mix, a living wage for one adult and one child goes up to $23.11 an hour. One adult and 2 kids is $27.64 an hour. Our minimum wage here in Oregon is $9.25. In a few years, this year, it's gonna go up to $13.50. Even when it does go up to $13.50 an hour, it won't be close to the amount of money that a single parent needs to raise 2 kids. At our current minimum wage, a minimum wage earner working 40 hours a week brings home about $1,200 a month after taxes. When it goes up to $13.50, it'll be about $1,900 a month after taxes with our new minimum wage. When we look at the cost of housing in our community, we know that the average one-bedroom apartment in Portland costs about $1,000 to $1,200 per month. A home is considered affordable if the cost of the unit is no more than 30% of a family's income. So for that minimum wage earner earning $1,200 a month, they would have to find a home for $400 a month for it to be affordable. And if you can find that, please call me or call Marc Jolin, because we need those places. But we know that this isn't a reality in our current community. Nationally, there are only 42 units of affordable housing available for every 100 low-income renters. This represents a deficit of 4.9 million units nationwide. Locally, Multnomah County alone, that shortage is 28,000 units of affordable housing. That means there are 28,000 families and individuals that aren't able to find housing that's affordable for their income. That doesn't mean there's no housing available. 85% of all the new construction in Portland is luxury housing, costing between $1,800 and $2,400 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. This luxury housing is affordable only to those who make above Portland's median income level, which is $51,000 for one person or $73,000 for a family of 4. Folks who make less than Portland's median income level, people like teachers, firefighters, waitresses, Apple Store employees, and corporate accountants just can't afford this new luxury housing that's being developed. A Portland teacher would have to pay over half her salary to live in the newly constructed apartments on Division or Williams. The housing that would be affordable for a teacher, housing that costs between $800 to $1,200 per unit, has less than a 1% vacancy rate, and we're short 28,000. Even people who have jobs can't find housing that they can afford. In order to end homelessness, we will need to create more housing, or else make our current stock of housing more affordable for low-income residents. So that was the first 2 causes of homelessness, lack of a living wage and lack of affordable housing. And the third is a lack of affordable health care and affordable mental health care. Even now that we have the Affordable Care Act, there are families and individuals that still face high deductibles, expensive prescriptions, and large copays. These expensive costs can push a person over the edge. Deciding whether to pay $1,500 for your deductible when you break your leg versus $1,200 in rent, that's a really hard decision that people have to make. Many parents that I know choose the medical care and then they get evicted from their housing. The fourth cause of homelessness is specific to families, but I feel I have to mention it. It's the lack of affordable child care. The average cost of childcare for one child in Portland is $932 per month. This is far too expensive for families who are living on low incomes. And it's often a catch-22 for families. They need childcare so they can go get an interview and get a job so that they can make money, but they need income from a job in order to be able to afford childcare in the first place. And so it really does cause a lot of hardships for families, especially those who only make minimum wage, $1,200 or $1,300 a month take home. And finally, the last cause of homelessness that I see over and over again is the persistent oppression and discrimination of people of color and people living with disabilities. It was illegal for African American people to own property in Portland until 1975. As a result of this and other discriminatory laws and practices, African American families have not been able to transfer wealth in the form of houses and property from generation to generation. This is a factor that leads to generational poverty in communities of color and makes it impossible for low-income families to make that leap into the middle class. So now that we've talked a little bit about the history of homelessness and heard a little bit of our context and talked about the root causes, I'd like to talk about what we can do to solve the problem. The solution to homelessness in our community is to create more housing that's affordable for people living on low incomes. The housing first philosophy is an evidence-based practice that suggests that when people and families are experiencing homelessness, they are experiencing trauma. The trauma affects the brain by putting it into a fight, flight, or freeze response. The brain is literally in survival mode, and the capacity for logical reasoning and critical thinking is literally turned off by a chemical in the brain called cortisol. The way to bring the brain back online is to provide the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs: shelter, clothing, food, and water. Traditional homeless shelters with cots stacked on floors does not qualify as proper shelter where people can heal enough to get out of their fight, flight, or freeze response. People need access to permanent housing in order for their brains to come back online and be able to be stabilized. Once people move into permanent housing and their brain comes back onto a logical thinking mode, then we can work with people to get jobs that offer more income, to learn new skills, to connect to their communities, and to keep their housing long-term. So we need two things. We need additional units of affordable housing for those with very low incomes, and we need a coordinated community response that can help families and individuals get housed as quickly as possible, and then work with them over the course of time to improve their lives and become stable in their housing. Right now, we don't have the solution in our community. We don't have enough units of affordable housing for people with low incomes, and we don't have enough services in our community for all the people that need them. People who are seeking services in our community have to wait 9 months for an intake for a mental health appointment, 12 months to get into a shelter, and 2 years to get on Social Security disability insurance. Families and individuals experiencing homelessness have to travel from downtown Portland down to Gresham and back downtown to access an array of social services from a number of different social service providers, many of whom are not connected to each other at all. Families have to tell their traumatizing stories multiple times to multiple organizations in order to get their basic needs met. In order to combat the effects of oppression, discrimination, and gentrification, in order to reduce the generational causes of homelessness and to truly solve homelessness, we need to make it easier for people to get help. It's going to take the faith community, the business community, local government, and the nonprofit community to all come together under a united effort to push our systems to integrate wraparound services in a coordinated way. There are 2 things that we, as faith communities, can do in our city right now to help this housing crisis and end this homeless state of emergency. First, we can all vote yes on the Yes for Affordable Homes campaign and pass this historic ballot measure 26-179, right, Jess? Which would dedicate $250 million to help build affordable housing for 3,000 Portlanders. You'll be hearing about this more from Jess Larson in just a few minutes, who is director of the Welcome Home Coalition. And second, in your faith communities, I invite you all to think about what kinds of assets your congregation might have that you could help contribute to help solve this homeless and housing crisis. Some congregations have huge buildings that are not used very often anymore, like University Park United Methodist Church saw an opportunity to significantly change the housing landscape in their neighborhood. They are knocking down their old fellowship hall and are building 25 units of affordable housing to house people who make under the median family income. You'll hear more about this amazing effort from Nielsen, the pastor at University Park. I believe that with strong leadership, creative ideas like what's going on with the Welcome Home Coalition and with University Park, with strong accountability and transparency, our community can end homelessness as we know it for thousands of people in our community who are living on the streets, in shelters, and who are camping in the woods. Housing is a basic human right, and I look forward to working with our community in a coordinated way, including all of our faith communities, to make our city a place where all individuals and families can afford to live. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brandi. We'd like to welcome up Jess Larson, director of the Welcome Home Coalition, Reverend Nielsen with University Park United Methodist Church, and Dr. Kenyon from Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon to join us on the panel. And would love it if Jess could kind of talk a little bit more about all those dashes and numbers that we heard from Brandi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm the director of the Welcome Home Coalition. Thank you, Brandi, for that lovely introduction and outline for why we must do this work in advocating for more affordable homes in our community and how we arrived here to this moment of crisis and need in our community. To add to Brandi's story, I'd like to share how I got here, why I've become a dedicated lifelong advocate for affordable homes. For about a decade, I worked down the street at Northwest Pilot Project, a lovely organization that helps seniors in Multnomah County who are experiencing a housing crisis. And when I started there as a case manager, I could welcome a senior into my office who was either losing their apartment because the rent was going up, but as we all know, the Social Security rarely keeps up with rising rents. Or maybe a senior who was already homeless and trying to get help with shelter and get back inside. And when I met that senior in my office in 2006,
I could say, I'm so glad you're here, you're at the right place, we'll do this together, we're gonna figure this out step by step. Let me call the guy I know down at the shelter, I'll get you in there tonight. I know it's shelter, 90 guys, it's stinky, there are rules, it's not awesome, but you'll be safe in from out of the cold. You can count on this place to sleep night by night, keep your stuff there as you need, and while you're at the shelter, you and I will work together on all the pieces to get you back inside, which is gonna take me about 3 to 4 months because that's just how long affordable housing wait lists are right now. And I'm sorry, I wish there weren't wait lists, but when your income is $1,000 with Social Security, this is about what you can afford. So let's get started and we'll get there together. And over the course of time that I was at Northwest Pilot Project, I figured out all the tricks of the trade, as we all do in whatever profession we choose, and how to help seniors overcome the rigmarole of the system, and who to call for what kinds of needs and help I needed to best advocate for my client, who is the best person at Social Security, what line never to stand in at the DMV, whatever the case might be. I became an expert in my field. But over the 10 years in housing services, what I needed most to do my job all but withered away. So now, when seniors go down the street to Northwest Pilot Project, or families to Portland Homeless Family Solutions, or women escaping domestic violence go to Bradley Angel, or vets go to transition projects, or any of the many organizations doing this impossible and dedicated work. Now what we tell people when they come in is, I'm so glad you're here, you're at the right place, we'll do this together. I'll call the guy I know at the shelter and get you on the fast list, which is months long now. And I'll get you on the best wait lists I'm aware of, but they're a year and a half right now. So you might have to go through the shelter a few times. And I don't know where you can stay tonight. I'm sorry. I wish I could do more. I'm sorry. It's an impossible job. It's getting harder and harder. And it's not about, how hard it is to do this job. If it's impossible for the workers going to work every day, think about the families waiting in these lobbies, the seniors who have this need for just simply an apartment that they can afford to rent. So I wanted to share that brief story about the 10 years in lived experience that matches Brandi's sort of outline of the policy that led us to this moment, and why we need to fight back and prioritize affordable homes as part of the infrastructure that our city can be proud of. Part of the city, part of what makes Portland great, just like our parks and our bike lines and our bike lanes and our libraries, affordable homes make our city accessible, make it safe, make it a better place for all of us to call home. And we're only going to get affordable homes, just like the infrastructure of bridges and parks and libraries and schools. We only get them when we value them and invest in them as a community. Affordable homes aren't real estate. They don't make any money. By their nature, the rents are kept as low as possible and often don't even cover the cost of operating the building. So we have to find the balance of investing in building very affordable and permanent housing that's as cost efficient as we can get it, but also permanently good housing that's very affordable for the people who need it. So fast forward, that's why we built the Welcome Home Coalition. That's why we as a community came together to say we need to have a dedicated cause focused on more affordable homes in our community. And we know the only way to get there is by finding dedicated resources to fund more affordable homes in our community because of the 40 years of divestment at the federal level, because we've never been able to keep up or build back what we've lost. And after months of research, after many more months of coalition building, after public opinion polling and surveys to understand where were the most viable opportunities for us to make a substantial impact and have a big success in affordable housing, we are here today, actually 13 days and 14 days away from passing the first passing the first ballot measure for affordable housing, a general obligation bond, just like we build those parks, libraries, and schools and bridges. we can build more affordable homes with this tool that we use all the time, and now for the first time, we use it to build affordable homes. So Measure 26179, if you are a Portland voter, you have the pleasure of joining us in this historic moment of voting yes for affordable homes. It's at the bottom and the back of your ballot, next to the pop text. And it will fund a $258 million bond will fund permanent homes for 3,000 Portlanders at any one time. But over the life of these buildings, over 60,000 Portlanders will be able to grow up and grow old with the assurance of a safe and affordable rent they can count on. So this is an investment into the future of our city. It's an investment into the people of our city, into generations to come. And it's one we must make. And it's an opportunity that we can continue to build upon when we do make this investment. So I'll stop there. I should also add one important detail. How do we pay for this general obligation bonds? We're asking Portland homeowners to contribute a modest impact to their property taxes of $75 on average per year. It's 42 cents on the $1,000 of assessed value, if you know your assessed value off the top of your head, which is drastically different than your market value, just FYI. But anyhow, an average impact of $75 a year, or $6.25 per month, which we think is important to point out in comparison to the other half of Portland, the Portland that rents in our city, the Portland that has experienced an increase in their housing costs on average of $128 a month in just the last year. And for seniors and veterans with disabilities and families with very low incomes, there's just no way to keep up. So this is a big first investment back into our affordable housing infrastructure, making our city safer and more accessible to all Portlanders. So I'll stop there. I'm sure there will be questions about the ballot measure and welcome home. And it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight, so thank you.
It's really helpful to hear about how policy changes can make a huge difference and how taxpayer dollars can make an investment in solving this crisis. Julia, you're pastor of University Park United Methodist Church up in North Portland, and tell us what the church is doing up there.
Sure. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we got to where we are too. Our church, University Park, is a small church. When we were beginning to explore these decisions, we were only 35 people. And so any of you are sitting there like, you have to be kind of a big church to build affordable housing. I am going to bust that myth right now. A couple of years ago, we as a congregation were asking ourselves a question, where are we going to head? What big vision is God calling us to next in the life of this place, in this neighborhood that we love so much, that we live in? And in the process, we made some discoveries we'll call coincidences about the building and the property that we are on, but we also discovered that we had a huge amount of energy to build housing. That housing energy came from about, I think some of them are here, I think it was like 8 weeks together of prayer and study and a little bit of community organizing tactics, thinking about what is the financial reality in our church, what's the need of our community, and what kind of assets do we have. I come from a background that is based in asset-based community development, and so we were having conversations kind of in those realms. And what we discovered was that with all the Bible study we were doing and all of the realities we were facing financially, we knew we needed to do something really, really different. We also had campers, like so many congregations probably in this room, we had campers on our property for quite a long time and had built relationships with those folks. In fact, some people who had come through our doors as houseless people had ended up becoming congregation members and leaders and had lent some wisdom to that process. But we were, doing the thing that congregations of all kinds do, giving away food every single day, bringing in, $1 here, $1 there to help people with their utilities and their rent, having people walk through the doors asking for, can I have a phone charger? Is there any way that I can use the phone? Is there any way I can use the bathroom? Then having folks living on our property. And we realized that for all of the food we were giving away, for all of the resources, we weren't ever actually changing very much. And so this fed a lot of our conversations in the fall of 2014 when we started talking about this. And what folks came together to understand was and we're Christians, so we talk a little bit about Jesus. And what we realized is that if Jesus were living in Portland this year, in this moment, that he would have said, not only, when was I thirsty and you gave me a drink of water, when was I naked and you clothed me, he would say, when was I homeless and you gave me some place to live? And that struck many of us as, it kind of hurt a little bit, because we hadn't been doing that in the way that we thought we could. Well, what's the one thing that churches always have? Property. What's the other one thing that churches always have? People with something they want to do. Like, if you've got a church, you've got people who want to do something. That's why they're there. And so we started thinking about, well, if we have property and we have people, what can we really pull off here? With the explorations we did throughout the next year, what we discovered is that we have the energy and the willingness to build affordable housing on our property. And took that, up and down the denominational levels and built partnerships with some of our community to try to do that work, and are in the midst of it. If all goes according to plan, we will begin permitting this winter, and we will break ground in the spring. And then we will be able to lease up in October of 2017. That's all after only about 2.5 years of community work and planning and fundraising. Which to me is the definition of a miracle, but it's also a reproducible miracle, which is the real magic of the thing. I really believe that if a congregation can come together around a single vision for how they really want to make a difference in their community, and in this community in particular, affordable housing is one of the ways that they can do that, and it is absolutely accomplishable. I have been intensely convinced that this is the work of the faith community right now in this city. I joke a little bit that we could start the kind of competition that everybody wants to win and lose at the same time, which is to see whose church can build affordable housing first. We all want to be able to do this work, and I think if we all really looked at the assets that we have available to us, we would all be able to find a way to do it. And even if it's, we're gonna build 26 units, but if we did 26 units, and the church down the street from us did 26 units, and the church down the street from them did 26 units, we'd be to that total number of what we need in Portland and in Multnomah County within a pretty quick span of time. So I'm super excited to talk about how we're pulling that off with you all, and I will tell you, there is hope. The church and faith communities of all kinds can do this. We can pull it off together.
It's really exciting to hear how one congregation is doing their part in the city. Dr. Howard Kenyon. Howard, you are with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, EMO for short. We're huge fans of EMO here at First Christian Church. Our very own Reverend Dr. Ronnie Page was instrumental in founding EMO like 100, 200 years ago, it seems like. That's an inside joke for First Christian. Tell us what's going on in terms of the ecumenical movement of not just churches, but I'm assuming not just Christian traditions, but others working together in the faith community in Portland on this issue.
Back when Rodney was roaming the land to and fro. Rodney Page, every time I see him and I talk about something EMO's doing, he says, I started that. And the reality is he did. But back 130 years ago, definitely before Rodney was alive, slightly before I was born, in the late 1880s, convent nuns began brick by brick to build what today is known as the Patton Home. It's a fascinating story. I think they're proto-ops with them and their habits, but they didn't always wear them when they were laying brick. And the name of that home became Home for the Friendless, which I think is probably appropriate for that day, but it certainly sounds weird in our modern day way of saying, but actually it was probably true. We just don't want to put it in those terms. And for the last 130 years, or whatever that is, that place has served low-income residents. It's amazing, the kinds of buildings we have around the city. 20 years ago, somehow that fell into EMO's hands, and today we serve about 63 residents in their building, single resident occupancy, bathrooms down the hall in most cases. We have a food service on the premises, which basically runs at a loss. The building runs at no profit at all, but it provides housing for people on average who earn about $10,000 a year, counting whatever Social Security, whatever else comes in. In other words, this is a place, like many places around the city, where if they didn't have that place, they wouldn't have any place. And it's alcohol-free, drug-free. It's just a place that people really call home, and it feels good about it. That's the one brick and mortar thing that emo does. There's a lot of things that we do that are not brick and mortar. Over the last 30-some years, we have helped to place, and I say we because it's a lot of people involved together, not just staff and volunteers, and a whole history of congregations and interfaith partners working together. Place something like 30,000 refugees in the city of Portland, beginning with the wave that came from Vietnam back when I was a young man. Which wasn't that long ago, really, to be honest with you. But, my kids think it was, back before dirt was invented. This year, the refugees were providing housing for, finding housing for before they get here, range from the Ukraine to Sudan, to Somalia, to Bhutan, and Myanmar, Burma, to Cuba, to many other places. But the challenge nowadays is much harder than it's ever been because there just is not a whole lot of housing available, affordable housing. So it's getting really, really hard for us, even as the number of refugees coming to the States is going to be increased officially by the U.S. government, we hope. But there is a shortage of places to place people, and it's affecting us deeply. There are other people that we find housing for, and that is some of our immigrants who've been here for a while. Maybe they used to be refugees, now they've lived here for a while, and some issues come up with domestic violence, and I won't go into all the detail of that except to simply say that in the Russian community, the Russian-speaking community, we have a program that provides housing for primarily women and usually their children who are suddenly needing to find housing. Maybe they don't speak English, they probably don't. They are stuck here, they don't know what to do, and they don't have an option, and so our team finds housing for them and helps them get started in that. About 30-some years ago, a program started with emo called Shared Housing. A great program that ran for many years. It was a wonderful program, funded originally through federal dollars that came down through the cities in the metro area until it was only the city of Portland that was funding it. And then about 4 years ago, if you remember, there was a major cut in city funding. And I always stop and think, do I want to be snarky about it and say that this was a decision made 4 years ago that causes the housing crisis today? I know it wasn't all of that, but it seems ironic that 4 years ago we cut the entire funding of $80,000 in those days for the shared housing program, and it died within a few weeks' time because that was its only source of funding. And there hasn't been a time when shared housing was more desperately needed than today. But just before it closed, a program was started out of that called Second Home. Started in Beaverton, it's now spread to Gresham Barlow, and also down to that remote place called Lincoln County that some of us visit during the summer. Because all over our state, there are young people that are basically unaccompanied and don't have a place to live. And the ones that we serve are those who are 16 or older, so they're independent actually. Can you imagine being 16 and fully independent? I wasn't independent until I was 45. They don't have a place to live, and so they're much more likely not to graduate from high school. We match them up with families that are interested in providing housing for them free of charge. Contracts are written up by dispute resolutions, which provides them something that shows on their credit rating as a young person that even though they didn't pay a dime for that housing, they lived up to this contract agreement. And what we're finding is that the graduation rate for these students grows from 50% to 95%. Now, I won't bore you with all the ways that we figured this out, but we've estimated that the number of young people we serve, because if they graduate from high school, they're more likely to have their own jobs and not live on the safety net. It saves taxpayers several $1 million over the span of the last 5 years. That's about $1 million a year. Well, about a year ago, some people began to bug me about why couldn't we bring shared housing back. Elders in Action, the County Office of Aging, Veterans, and Disability, to name 2 primary organizations. And I said, sounds like a wonderful idea. We keep getting calls every month from people, where's your shared housing program, what happened to it? But we just don't have the money, so I don't know what we're going to do. But they pestered me until I just said, okay, we'll work on this. And together we've been teaming up. The team has grown larger and larger. It's an amazing team. I met with them this afternoon. And we now have a commitment from the Florida Housing Bureau for $58,000 for this fiscal year. We are working on Meyer Memorial Trust. If any of you are members over there, we can't wait to hear from you in the next couple of weeks. The city of Beaverton is taking some serious looks at this. And I'm telling this crowd for the first time publicly that we hope to have this launched by January. That is just 3 months away. It will take us some time before we can match housing because people are desperate for housing, but it's a case of matching home providers with home seekers. Home providers they can be people with some means who have mansions and huge rooms in their house, but it also can mean people that are desperate to keep their own homes, whether they rent or buy them. And with rents going up sometimes at $300 a month, just like that, these are people that are facing eviction themselves. They would love to have somebody to share the rent with and move into their house. We provide a match for that under this plan. And so we are very excited that this is going to happen and bring back a program that was very successful in the city of Portland and the greater area for 30 years. And it's an amazing team that's been working on this. There is so much that is to be done. We don't serve but a fraction of those people, but it's congregations coming together, faith communities, and I mean that interfaith partners, Muslim and Jewish and other groups as well, that work together to accomplish things that we couldn't do by ourselves. And the fact of the matter is that something like shared housing is just about available for anybody. You can be low income and provide a place for somebody that's even more desperate than you are. On February 7th, we will have our very regular Interfaith Advocacy Day in Salem, and we'll focus on a number of issues. If housing is your concern, and I assume it is because you're here, join us for that day so that we can talk to state legislators about ways that we can improve the housing situation, because, friends, I've discovered housing is not a problem just here in Portland. I was in Gold Beach, Oregon. How many of you know where that is? Serious housing problem because all the houses are being bought up as summer rentals, and even doctors can't find a decent house to live in. And as they go to a lower level of housing, then they push out the person below them until there are people camping out. And you say, well, that's a wonderful place to camp out. Well, maybe about 3 days in the summer when the sun shines. But other than that, a dry place, a warm place is hard to be had in so many other areas of Oregon. I serve on the Emergency Food and Shelter Board in representing EMO there. It's a board that channels FEMA funding to our shelters in the city as well as to the Oregon Food Bank. There is so much to be done, but I want to emphasize this note, that what I'm fascinated by is how many congregations and individuals by the thousands are teaming up in many ways, large and small, to achieve some incredible solutions to the housing problem. And you can look and you can say, boy, this is not what's being done. But I'd like to just for a moment point to you and say, look, this is what has been done in our city, and it's pretty impressive. And you're here tonight as a witness to that reality.
Marc, Jolin, why don't you join in the panel? I'm gonna invite Marc to join the panel. Marc was a longtime activist on the streets with Join, and has now moved into a role with Multnomah County government with Home for Everyone. And so we've heard how we can vote on certain things, we've heard how we can dream together in our congregations or across church traditions, but we're wondering what you might have to offer tonight for us in this conversation.
Hey Adam, could you move your mic?
Oh yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafori wasn't able to come tonight, but asked me to come
and share a few thoughts, starting with her appreciation for all of the work that is happening already, for all of the commitment that exists in the faith community generally to helping us address the crisis of homelessness in the community. And that crisis is real. As you've heard tonight, there is both a desperate need out in our community for more affordable housing, for the services that are necessary to help people get into and remain in that housing. And as much as there is a desperate need, there is also a tremendous amount of amazing work happening. And I take Brandi's point because I was out in the drug service world until 2 years ago, that the system needs to be better coordinated. It needs to be easier for people to access. There has to be more coordination, more concerted effort to view the services through the eyes of the people who are trying to access them and understand whether they're working from their perspective, not just from the administrative side of things. Last year, despite our imperfect coordination, the nonprofits and faith organizations that participate in our collective efforts were able to help 9,000 people avoid becoming homeless in the first place. 9,000 people who received some form of assistance from a myriad of nonprofits and partners in the community who were able to engage with those families before they ever entered the shelter system, to help them with rent assistance or problem solving with a landlord who would have evicted them if they hadn't been able to get a handle on whatever was going on in their apartment and was challenging them. And that same community of organizations also helped last year 4,600 people move out of shelter, out of dangerous domestic violence situations, off the streets, and back into permanent housing. So 4,600 people, our neighbors, who, but for the work of all of you and all of us in this community, would have still been homeless. I can tell you that because of the Step Up efforts over the last couple of years, when this Home for Everyone initiative started, and I can give you the background on that, it started just about 2 years ago, our community was only able to help 3,000 people a year move into permanent housing. We got to 4,600 last year. The need is growing, there is no question, but as a local community, we really have stepped up. We have come together in a pretty unprecedented way to not just acknowledge that there's a crisis, but to try to start to confront it. In addition to all those folks who we were able to help avoid becoming homeless in the first place, and all those folks we were able to help move out of homelessness and back into permanent housing, more than 6,600 people received emergency shelter last year. That was a 40% increase over the year before that. In part, that's a function of how many people are finding themselves in need of shelter, but in part it represents the fact that as a community, as much as we don't want, and Brandi's absolutely right, shelter is the least desirable option. If we can keep someone in their housing, we want to do that. If we can help move somebody into permanent housing tomorrow, we want to do that. But if we have nothing else to offer, and we've got a parent with a child who is facing sleeping on the street, or an elderly disabled individual who will be truly vulnerable outside, we've got to have a shelter bed for that person. So even as we've expanded prevention, even as we've expanded permanent housing placement capacity, we've also expanded shelter. And in the last year, we went from funding about 560 year-round shelter beds total. Plus, there are a lot of faith-based shelter beds out there that don't receive public funding, several hundred, Rescue Mission, City Team, and others. But there were 560 year-round publicly funded shelter beds beginning of 2015. In the last year, we've added another 562 to that. We've basically doubled it, and by the end of this fiscal year, we'll be at least 650 additional shelter beds. And those are beds for families. We took our family shelter, the largest one. Brandi runs a really critical shelter for families, but we also had opened a winter shelter for families with 90 people in it originally just in the winter. We moved it to year-round. The building moved to a bigger one, so 130 people could be accommodated. We have no turnaway shelter right now. The nightly census is well over 200 people and families who are accessing that shelter. We opened a veteran-specific shelter, actually with the help of this congregation and others down here, and they're now located at Rose City Park United Methodist Church for 1025 veterans. We have a new women's shelter in Gresham. It's the first single women's shelter in Gresham for 90 women with dedicated DV services on site. And in the middle of November, we'll open 120 beds of shelter, permanent shelter for couples, something we've never had before. So we've both expanded shelter capacity, and importantly, we're not just creating more of the type of shelter we've always had. We're really looking hard at the type of shelter we offer, who's coming in and who's not, and adjusting the rules and the requirements so that people who historically have said, you know what, if I can't come with my partner, or I can't come with my pet, or I can't come with my belongings, I'm going to stay outside. We don't want people having to make that choice. We had 500 entirely unsheltered women, adult women, in our last point in time count, entirely unsheltered. We went into the shelter expansion effort committed to trying to get to a place where no woman had to make the choice to stay outside, that we could offer any woman who wanted inside, whether in a couple or individually, at least a safe place to sleep. But again, and this is important, ultimately the solution is not shelter. None of us want to be opening more shelter. It's not a good investment of our resources. It is not the best outcome for any family or individual who's homeless tonight. And so the solution to homelessness is where we started with Brandi, which is we need more affordable housing units. We don't need more shelter if we can move more people out of shelter and back into housing, because that frees up that bed and another person can come into it. But if we can't move folks out of the shelter into housing, then folks just stack up outside. So we will do everything locally with your help and the participation of the faith community to continue to expand our investments in all three areas: prevention, placement, and shelter. But ultimately, we want prevention. We want placement, not shelter, and that requires affordable housing units. So I appreciate that you're all here. I'm so grateful for the work that everybody on this panel is doing, that many of you are all involved in. It is an imperfectly coordinated, but really critically important collective effort that all of us are involved in. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Marc. So let's open it up to some questions for the panel or for Brandi in the next few moments. I have a question first for Pastor Julia. You talked about something called asset-based community development, ABCD. Say more about that. What is it?
Thank you. It's a way of doing community development that looks at what resources are already existing in wherever you are. So that can mean, you look out at a community, at a neighborhood, at a group of people and say, we can't do anything with this, right? But when you start to really dig into it, you find out actually this person has a relationship with this important person, or somebody who, this person has a skill, or actually there's money here, or a little bit of land there, or whatever, and you start to build based on what those things are, and that's where the momentum comes from, instead of lack-based community development where you say, oh, here's a need to be fixed, and that we're just going to keep pouring things onto that need until somehow maybe magically it gets fixed. You pull together what there is and then build momentum from there.
That's great, thank you. Other questions for the panel and Brandi?
It's a question for Pastor Jolin. So it costs a lot to build housing, and I'm just curious, what kind of funding were you able to obtain?
Yeah, so we did a couple of things. We raised about 10% from congregational donations, and we sold a parsonage, a piece of property that we own in North Portland. And then we're going to have bank loan, actually, with Pacific Continental Bank, and they're specialists in affordable housing. They know what they're doing with nonprofits, and so it was a great gift to us to be able to partner with them. And what will happen, this is one of the really wonderful things about doing this project, actually, especially for smaller churches that aren't entirely sure how to fund things, is that once you start obtaining rents from your from your tenants, then those go straight back into paying off the loan. So in the end, it's kind of a no impact financially for the church itself, so we can begin to immediately pay back that bank loan and be on our way toward actual ministry and relationship with the folks who are living in the apartments.
Saw a question over here. Yeah.
For Brandi, I remember probably it was about 4 years ago that you hosted conversations introducing the concept of little houses on common pieces of property, and at that time it sounded like the city was interested with some funding and stuff. What's happened with that concept?
I might also pass this over to Marc a little bit too. So there have been a couple of people who have come forward in the city over the last 4 or 5 years that have this idea of building tiny homes for people who are experiencing homelessness. They've actually done it down in Eugene at a property down there. They have a large village of tiny homes where people live, and then a lot of times they have community centers where there are activities and community building resources and sometimes life skills classes. And I think it's a really great model for people who have land, who can't or aren't able to go through the process that Jules is going through. But if you have property or land, you can put tiny homes on there to allow people to live in. There's a lot of conversation about is that dignified or not. And I would say that if you're going to pay $1,800 for a 500 square foot apartment in the Pearl, then tiny home doesn't seem so bad. I think what's important about the tiny homes to think about is the services that we, the nonprofits, provide to people try to build dignity, restore power, and promote autonomy. And so that's what the tiny homes do. More than putting people in a shelter where they have to share a space with a bunch of people or sleeping outside or camping, a tiny home is pretty dignifying. It's your own space, your own bathroom, everything. And so I think it's a great idea. One downside is that they don't, if you were to have a building like Jules is going to have, it's going to appreciate over time, and tiny homes won't appreciate. They will likely depreciate. So some financial conversations there. But Marc, do you know anything about the cities or the county's efforts to build tiny homes?
So less about building them, because I've in this conversation multiple times a week. I've never seen so much enthusiasm around the idea of building. This is though an area where the legal framework, the land use framework we have has not caught up with the creativity of the community. And there is a bunch of work happening. Brandi is right, theoretically you could take a piece of land and put down tiny houses or pods, and there are lots of different concepts, much more completely built out tiny houses that look like accessory dwelling units with plumbing and electrical and so forth. And then at the other end of the spectrum, and I think this is what you're talking about in Eugene, are more like sleeping pods. They're hard-sided structures, but they're not necessarily well insulated, they're not electrified, things like that. It's just a better place to sleep than if you were having to sleep in a tent, for example. So you have a spectrum, and none of those things fit well into our current building codes. The idea of hosting these kinds of structures as actual residential uses don't fit well into our land use codes yet. So there's a lot of work happening at the city to try to figure out how to accommodate this creativity, because I think most everyone at this point recognizes that these can and should be part of the solution. One of the things that A Home for Everyone did over the last year and a half was bring our executive committee, which includes our mayor and our county chair and our housing commissioner and other community leaders, to the point of saying, yes, we actually think these kinds of, we're calling them outdoor pop-up shelters for lack of a better term, but these kinds of village concepts can and should be part of our response to the need for shelter in our community. So there's actually a package of zoning code amendments coming forward to City Council next week that address emergency shelter broadly, but also include some provisions that would make it easier for churches to host these kinds of sleeping pods on their property under certain conditions if they were supported, essentially. So I do think there's a lot of momentum in that direction, but it is going to continue to take some work, because for a congregation that is hosting, or a business that is hosting, or someone who just wants to allow their land to be used in this way, having it actually be lawful to use it that way does make a difference. And certainly that's what I'd like to see us get to, is that you can really harness this creativity and these alternative concepts. We've had Dignity Village in our community for 12, 13 years, more than that, 16, 17 years at this point. We have Right to Dream, so we have some local examples as well of alternative sheltering concepts that we know work, and these can go towards that.
Jess, did you have a follow-up?
I'll just add a comment that I think that we have some work to do about protecting some of our current tiny home villages, people I'm saying all in air quotes. Mobile home parks provide some of the most affordable homes in our community, and they are at the greatest risk right now for lost affordability as the value of land increases so quickly in our city. Very, very vulnerable, very low income community members who live successfully in their own tiny homes for years are at risk of losing those homes. And it's a challenge, but also a real opportunity for us to take some of this enthusiasm around tiny homes, to take some of the potential new revenue through our general obligation bond, to invest in these mobile home parks, to protect tenants from displacement, to improve the quality of the structures that they're living in, the safety of the parks, and maybe even make the parks more dense and bring in more tiny homes to help resolve homelessness for other community members. So I always like to add in, hey, we do have tiny home villages and we need to help protect them from being lost in our community too.
Great work. Thank you very much. Other questions? Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion about mental health issues, and it seems like we always raise attention to the mental health issues that need to be addressed, and we need more mental health services. But we also know that there are many people who don't need counselors or access to medication who are on the street. What they need is institutional care. They cannot be managed by counselors or mental health services. They require institutional care. And too many years ago, in somebody's wisdom, it was discovered that those people really could get along outside because they weren't dangerous. And that was a travesty, because these people have suffered enormously because we did not provide for them what they absolutely had to have in order to survive, and that was custodial care. Is there anyone talking about restoring custodial institutional care for the people who really need it?
I can take this one a little bit. So there is this concept in the kind of housing world called permanent supported housing, and that's really it's housing where you have on-site medical staff that visit you every single day. You have all your needs met depending on how how much help you need or how little help you need. Permanent supportive housing, and this is one of the kinds of housing that through the federal disinvestment in housing over the last 40 years, this is a kind of housing that has really been eliminated from the scene. And so there are efforts for lots of organizations to bring permanent supportive housing units back online. Central City Concern and Cascadia are two of the leading nonprofits in our community that do this kind of work, and I know that they are constantly looking for more. I think that they did, Central City just bring a whole bunch of new PSH units online this year, and some folks up there might be able to talk more about the numbers, but it's definitely recognized as a need. We need a lot more permanent supportive housing for the people exactly like you're talking about. Jess or Marc, do you want to add anything about PSH?
So Central City Concern just announced that they're going to initiate the development of, I think, 221 units of permanent supportive housing of various kinds, generally focused on a medically fragile community of people in partnerships with the healthcare system. I think what I heard you asking about was actual institutionalization, so custodial care, where folks are essentially, and that has been a topic of conversation and is a very challenging one. I think most folks would agree that with deinstitutionalization, there was supposed to be a full investment in community-based care, and that was both the housing and the on-site support services that someone would need who was being discharged in order to stay healthy and stay successful. And we didn't make that investment. We did a great job of deinstitutionalizing, and then we did a terrible job of investing in what we knew people were going to need if they came out and were going to be living outside. Separate from that, there is a subset, and I'm not a mental health expert, but there is certainly a subset of people who today are wandering around the streets of downtown Portland who are decompensating every single day, and because we can't establish the threshold of being an imminent risk to themselves or others, they can't be taken into care against their will to be given the opportunity to get healthy. And the community struggles with that conversation. There's a very strong civil liberties interest that, of course, folks have not to be taken into custody, essentially into custodial care. And at the same time, we know that there are folks for whom the ability to make a decision about what's in their best interest is severely compromised. And so this conversation's been broached multiple times, but never moved very far because of the tension that exists between those kind of two competing sets of interests. So I wish I had a better answer for you other than to know lots of people talk about it. There are states that have different hold standards that are a little more towards the side of being able to take folks in and hold them than Oregon's is, but I've not seen that conversation progress very far.
We have time for a couple more questions.
This question is for Reverend Julia. Did your denominational system share your vision and or offer any support?
Yeah, they caught the vision pretty quickly. We're United Methodist, and the region really understood that, you know, what's going on in the Northwest around housing, and sort of began to explore that, signed on pretty quickly to the idea that it was a good one. Where it gets crunchy is when you actually ask them to support you financially. You know, and so where we are right now, anybody who's worked with denominations knows what I'm talking about. Where we are right now is this push-pull of, okay, let's explain what the real risks are. There aren't a lot of real risks because of the way the model works, because it is rent-based and all of that I explained earlier, and getting the folks at the denominational level to feel like there's enough risk that it's an innovative ministry, but not so much risk that it's a risky ministry. Aha. That turns out that there's a little bit of a gap between those two concepts, and institutions are always, I think, in my experience, more risk averse than the folks who inhabit them. And so we're in that right now, and we'll find out some things in the next month or so about what that will look like and what that will mean. But along the way, they have really moved with the local church level for the most part, sometimes about a step and a half behind as far as innovation goes. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Or policy-oriented point of view. So I'm assuming that this bill we started off talking about today is probably a small slice of tackling the entire problem. First off, what percentage of people are we actually addressing the needs of compared to the total number of people who could maybe afford affordable housing versus what's available? And then what would it actually take in terms of increasing revenues to actually meet everyone's needs?
Thank you, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it in backwards order, maybe.
Okay.
There's a national campaign that doesn't get much coverage because it's a long shot and we'll probably not see it through in our lifetime, but it is to reform the mortgage interest deduction at the national level to reduce the cap on mortgages that take the deduction from $1 million mortgages down to $500,000 mortgages. And so all of us homeowners who get this interest deduction when we do our taxes every year, if our mortgages were over $500,000, we would only get the deduction up to that $500,000 mark. And if we were to make this national reform with the mortgage interest deduction, we would create a $300 billion revenue stream and invest it in affordable housing and be able to end homelessness and the need for housing as we know it in a matter of a decade or so. It would adequately meet our need for affordable housing. This simple but not so simple policy fix and redistributing of our priorities for making housing affordable. The mortgage interest reduction is theoretically in place to help make home ownership affordable, but what if we reduced how we structured it and invested that into deep affordability for renters throughout the country? So that's an example of the scale of the solution we'll need to continue to work towards. It will definitely require national level legislation and fixes to this crisis that started there. So we're left with what can we do here at the local level. And with this general obligation bond before Portland voters this year, we will be able to create homes for 3,000 Portlanders. And when we consider how many Portlanders are homeless on our streets or homeless in our communities, whether that's in our shelters or on the streets on any given night, the last estimation is 4,400. We can argue that we're making a really big impact where the need is greatest. There is an estimated need for 25,000 deeply affordable homes in our community. So if we're thinking that this bond is going to build 1,300 of them, that's a small slice of that pie. However, I just came from the inclusionary housing hearing, and that is a new tool that's coming online that will help to add to our affordable housing inventory. Similarly, we've added construction excise tax that's generating about $10 to $15 million of new money for the first time in this booming market that will be helping us to build more affordable homes. And I'm speaking with the Portland Housing Bureau this afternoon, and they have about 1,900 homes, affordable homes in the pipeline, which is more than double what we've been able to produce in years before. And this has everything to do with new resources that we've been able to secure in the last couple of years because the community's come together outraged and saying this is our priority, we need to find more funding tools. So when you add all this up together, we are making a very, very big impact in a new way that we haven't been in affordable housing inventory. But to be realistic and very honest, we'll have to continue investing at this level of a substantial kind at the local level, but also bring the state on board because we know that in rural communities that are struggling with this housing crisis, and we are all very familiar with it, there aren't these kinds of options for family shelters or emergency rent assistance or even affordable housing the way we have it here in Portland. And so a lot of very poor Oregonians from throughout the state are left with no other option but to come to the metro region. And so we really need to take this problem on statewide and then of course nationwide too.
Obviously, we're not the first city to deal with similar issues as this, and other cities have tried things, and some have worked and some have not, and none of them are Portland. So I'm just curious if you could speak to what makes us different in that regard, and in terms of what kind of solutions, and we've talked about our unique context here, and what have we learned from past efforts that have not worked in cities that have addressed, that maybe have had meetings just like this, and have just seen the thing increase?
Well, I'll start. I think there are probably other parts of this question that we can all together answer. Many cities have been taking affordable housing, many cities and counties have been taking affordable housing to voters for a long time. Seattle's been passing a local option levy since 1981 to first fund affordable housing for seniors, and then they were so successful with that, they took it back to voters, and they made it a permanent tool, and now they're providing housing for all kinds of populations in need. And actually, this most recent levy they just passed in August doubled the amount, the size of the tax. So now the average Seattle homeowner has increased their tax burden to $130 a year. And Seattle's just one example of many cities that have these kinds of tools of dedicated, voter-backed mechanisms that they use to fund affordable homes. There are a lot of cities that use the general obligation bond tool that we're going to use, and in fact, Portland is one of 27 cities and counties voting on affordable housing on November 8th. So there's examples of a lot of kinds of tools and momentum throughout the country to take this up at the local level. What's really different in Portland and in the West Coast, it has a lot to do, I think, with land use and the way we structured our cities and the way we developed throughout the region. We also have a difference in how we prioritize housing services. I should really pass the mic on to have Marc talk about this, but in some states they have a right to shelter, and so they've funded, spent enormous dollars in funding shelter, and families are waiting even longer to get out of shelter into affordable housing. So there are many points of policy difference, and it's really impossible to compare apples to apples when it comes to this, but we can learn from other cities and the particular policies that they're using and what's working well.
So, because Jess called it out, so New York City just announced that they have 60,000 people in emergency shelter in families. And they do have a right to shelter. And when we go to conferences, and this is part of my answer to your question, when we go to conferences and hear what other cities are doing, New York is desperately trying to figure out how to do prevention, because they've got, they don't have a housing inventory either. The costs of housing are high. They have some things we don't, so at least some regulated housing, but we have 60,000 people in shelter, and they spend an enormous amount of their money just to sustain that. So, we have the ability to look at other cities that started to experience the homelessness crisis at the kind of scale we're seeing now earlier, and how they responded. And initially there was this big emphasis on shelter, as Brandi was describing, and it didn't work. So we know in other cities like us are looking and doing the same kind of analysis around prevention and placement and shelter. The strategies that you've heard about, housing first, rapid rehousing, these are all well sort of established national best practices, in every single city that takes this issue seriously is trying to implement those strategies. I think, and this is again like any area of expertise or practice, even though we all are doing those things, we have to be talking to each other, because everyone's doing a little bit of a modified version, right? They learned something about how to better align employment and housing services, and it's a really good program. And we're going to go look at that, and we're going to take that from them and implement it here. We were down in San Francisco last year looking at a shelter model that they have. They call it a navigation center, and it is a shelter that brings entire camps of people in at once, because it embraces that sense of community that exists in that camp, and says, we're not asking you to split up, please come in and bring your animals and bring your possessions. And so, so we learn from that. We're looking at that as we go to expand our shelter capacity. I think if you want to understand why different cities are in different places, it has to do less with the strategies and more with the structural context that they are in. The West Coast cities that are seeing incredible in-migration are not able to keep pace on the housing, have the low vacancy rates and the skyrocketing rents, and have not been able to close the income gap. So even as the community gets wealthier, the lowest income people are continuing to see the real value of their wages go down. We are all having the same kind of experience. We are all seeing street homelessness go up. We are all being challenged to figure out the balance between shelter and housing. So we actually last year, our mayor brought together the West Coast mayors of Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles to compare notes. They were here in town for a day to say, we are all having the same challenge, and we need to learn from each other, and frankly, we need to unite with a focused ask of the federal government to get back to the table on affordable housing investment. They've shown they can do it. They invested in ending veterans' homelessness. And in every city where they made a massive investment like they did in Portland, we've been able to leverage that into real success. So we're close. We've got a housing option, at least work that we can do with every single veteran who becomes homeless. It can be done, but we need that kind of investment across the board. And that was a big piece of the shared learning.
Thank you. Tonight's topic and conversation has helped me remember the proverb that says this: whoever is kind to those in need, the poor, the hungry, those who live outside, lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. This is not just a political issue or a social justice issue, but this is a way that we, as people of faith, can return worship to God. And so I want to thank the panel tonight. I want to thank Brandi. I want to thank Allie Moore for helping organize the event, and Emily Leach from Pacific Continental Bank. Give everyone a round of applause. Remember, 2 takeaways. One, do that ABCD approach that Julia mentioned earlier. Think about the assets that you have in your own communities, whether it's your local congregation or maybe your denominational networks, and think about what you can do back home, so to speak, to work on this. And yes, please vote yes. And we have literature and so forth that you can take.
Sorry,
Yeah, turn it off.
I just would be in trouble by the campaign manager if I didn't say this. So we have 13 more days to talk to voters, and there's a lot on the ballot, and many voters don't know that this ballot measure is on the Portland ballot. So we're finding our volunteer time is so incredibly valuable. If you can give a few hours of the next 2 weeks to the campaign to come in and call voters or go out and knock on voters' doors on the weekends, it makes all the difference in making sure that we can help pass this ballot measure. And you just can simply sign up on the clipboards on the way out, or you can also pick up a lawn sign. That's all.
Great. We'll have a Bridgetown Forum event in the new year around ending the death penalty in the state of Oregon. It's still illegal. So look to that. Join our email list if you haven't yet. And please stay for conversation and coffee and tea. Thank you.